Robin Hood is perhaps the most recognisable figure in English folklore. Along with his band of merry men, Robin darts through legend, standing up to the wealthy and living in Sherwood Forest. And since the 20th century, plenty of different film and TV adaptations mean there is a Robin to suit almost everyone. Yet discussions in the past try to claim Robin as an ancient god, recast as a literary outlaw, or as one of the good folk, whether a local sprite or Robin Goodfellow himself. How on earth did these writers draw the conclusion that Robin Hood was anything other than a leading character in a series of medieval ballads? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Welcome to our final episode in this particular fictional or not folklore series that we've kind of ended up with this month. And it's been quite interesting actually to see how I picked these figures actually sometime last year and they've ended up working together really well. And it's funny how that kind of thing happens. Now, before I forget, I'm going to do our This Episode Was Brought to You By segment. And this episode was brought to you by French honeysuckle, which in the Victorian language of flowers meant generous and devoted affection, which I thought was a nice one to get started with. Anyway, on to the actual episode. So we are looking at Robin Hood this week. And Robin does fit in well with the other figures from this month. So if we look at Queen Mab and Herne the Hunter, they may have been part of older traditions, but they do obviously first make their named appearance in writing via Shakespeare. King Arthur obviously has plenty of legends about him, and if he did exist, then the links between the historical reality and the legends are clearly tenuous. Robin, however, is almost entirely fictional, and I know that we've all been told that he was based on all these different people and so on, but this did actually come from the mouth of Ronald Hutton himself in a talk that he gave to the Last Tuesday Society, and he was saying that you can see the stories about Robin as essentially being composite stories about lots of other outlaws that have then been put together to make Robin. Now, I should point out that this episode is unconcerned with whether or not Robin Hood actually existed. I don't really think that that's a particularly helpful debate, and people who are better qualified than me and have more experience with Robin Hood than me have drawn conclusions one way or the other. Obviously, this is a folklore podcast, so I originally wanted to look at how Robin appears in folklore. But of course, that's kind of pointless because we actually have the legends for that. They are the folklore. And after looking into him further, I did actually find this really odd side to Robin Hood, and this is all the weird mythical stuff that's projected onto him. So that's what we're going to have a look at in this episode. But I did want to provide a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of Robin Hood before we look at his links with myth, just in case anybody isn't as familiar with him. Obviously, I'm like, oh, everybody is because I'm in the British Isles, but obviously I don't know further afield. So we'll have a little bit of background. So the first known literary reference is in 1377 apparently, and all of the earliest texts about Robin Hood are ballads. So much like the other figures, as I say, particularly Herne and Mab, he first appears in literature. Now, there are some manuscripts that claim that the real Robin was born in around about 1160 in South Yorkshire. In Locksley, others claim he came from Wakefield and was part of Thomas of Lancaster's 1322 rebellion. Loads of different people try to claim he's from different periods or he is a literary version of a particular historical figure. But like I say, we're not really interested in that. His stories do link him with both Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood's Bay, and some chroniclers place him in the reign of Edward II, while others put him under Richard I, which I think is probably the one more people will be familiar with from the different adaptations, particularly things like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and so on. Sometimes Robin finds his way to fight in the Crusades, and these legends then see him as a noble whose lands are seized by the Sheriff of Nottingham, which if nothing else is quite a good plot device to explain exactly why Robin seems to have such a beef with the Sheriff in the first place. Obviously, the Sheriff was most notably played, in my opinion, by Alan Rickman. Anyway, Robin fell ill towards the end of his life, and Little John took him to Kirklees Priory near Huddersfield because his aunt was the prioress there. Unfortunately, Sir Roger de Doncaster had apparently persuaded her to betray Robin, so she essentially bled him too often, because obviously bloodletting being this accepted medical practice at the time. She did it too often. Robin realised too late what was happening, and then he managed to call for Little John, who then carried Robin to the window, and Robin loosed a single arrow, and Little John allegedly buried him where the arrow landed, which is apparently the mound in Kirklees Park. Now, I did actually watch an episode of Expedition Unknown ages ago, in which host Josh Gates went in search of Robin's grave at Kirklees, and it does very much look like that mound is empty. I do want to point out that Maid Marian doesn't appear in the original stories that gave rise to the legend. She only appears later, connected with Robin for the first time in The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. So over the years, Robin has been a yeoman, a noble stripped of his riches, an Englishman pushing back against the Normans, and a rebel fighting back against clashed oppression. And to be fair, even our belief that Robin robbed from the rich to give it to the poor is actually a little bit wrong, because the earlier stories are essentially adventure tales and they're not really concerned with financial issues at all. It is true that across all of these stories, Robin is an outlaw, literally living outside of the law, and it was quite interesting that outlaws could come from any part of society as well. We never really find out why Robin's an outlaw, but ultimately it doesn't really matter, because as J.C. Hall points out, and I quote, "The identity of the man matters less than the persistence of the legend," end quote. Now, adaptation really does lie at the centre of Robin's legend, and again quoting from J.C. Holt, in each generation it acquired new twists from shifts in the composition, outlook and interest of the audience, or changes in the level of literacy or developments in the means of communication, end quote. And I think that's what we definitely see when we see him make the leap to the big screen. Even if you just looked at the things that were made in the 20th century, you've got different Robins to represent different things, really. My favourite version always going to be the Disney one with the foxes. However, I did also love Maid Marian and Her Merry Men on the BBC, when Robin was totally useless. So again, completely different way of representing a character depending on what the social context was at the time. Now, plenty of scholars have argued as to whether Robin is a real person, but as I say, there is a far more interesting aspect to Robin if we're going to look at this from a folklore point of view, which obviously this is a folklore podcast, so that's clearly what we're going to do. And this is really where it relates to whether or not he represented mythical figures, some pre-Christian witch cult, try saying that quickly, the good neighbours, or whoever else people have tried to link him to. And all of this is even more impressive given the total and utter lack of supernatural elements in the Robin Hood stories. But let's get into it. Now, it wouldn't be a discussion, and I'm laughing already because I know where I'm going with this, but it wouldn't be a discussion of a figure that's supposed to represent a god or something without Jacob Grimm. And William E. Simeon actually noted that Jacob Grimm tried to claim a really weird mythic component of Robin Hood in Deutsche Mythology of 1835. And Grimm claimed, and I quote, "In England, Robin Goodfellow seems to get mixed up with Robin Hood the Archer," end quote. Although, if I'm completely honest, not that many people other than him and a couple of others seem to actually confuse Robin Goodfellow and Robin Hood, but never mind. Grimm then also suggests that Robin Hood was derived from a goblin that was somehow universally known to people, and this somehow becomes preferable to the different attempts at a historical backstory. Now, there's no actual evidence presented to back up the assertion, and Grimm never returned to the idea, so it's difficult to know why he brought it up in the first place. Now, Grimm wasn't the first to make that link, because Reginald Scott had likewise drawn a link between the two characters, and this was in 1584, except for him it was because Robin Goodfellow always wore a cap or a hood, so he then seemed to think that that linked him to Robin Hood. Now, that is as much as he says on the matter, so it is quite unclear to what extent Scott thought Robin Goodfellow and Robin Hood were one and the same, or if he just kind of thought that there was a little bit more to it, we don't really know. Thomas Keightley also drew the same link, and in 1828 he said, and I quote, "Robin Goodfellow answers to the Nissa Godring of the Norwegians. He was called Robin Hood because, like the Nis and the Brownie, he wore a hood," end quote. So yeah, that's literally how they draw the link between Robin Goodfellow and Robin Hood, the fact that they reckon that Robin Goodfellow wears a hood, so it must be the same person. If you can hear the utter scorn in my voice, there's a good reason for that. But I did think it was worth having an aside to have a quick look at Robin Goodfellow just to see if there were any obvious links between him and Robin Hood. And I think I have mentioned Robin Goodfellow on the podcast before, but again, I thought it was quite useful to revisit him here. Now, you might know Robin Goodfellow better as Puck. Shakespeare definitely didn't invent him, but he did popularise him for us through his appearance in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, despite various attacks on his character by Protestant writers, people did continue to believe in Robin Goodfellow in the early modern period. He was especially associated with the home, where he punished maids who didn't clean to his standards by pinching them. And yes, we did see that with Queen Mab as well. Now, Robin Goodfellow expected payment of white bread and milk for helping with the chores, and missing the payment could see Robin steal milk or grain to make up for it. And it was also advised to leave out a bucket of clean water for Robin and his fairy companions to bathe in. So Kitely's reference to the Nissa and Brownie makes sense in this context for Robin Goodfellow as a form of house spirit or household fairy. But the idea that he wore a hood, giving him his name, is less obvious, but it does also suggest that Robin Hood the household spirit and Robin Hood the archer were not actually the same figure. Now, Robin Goodfellow was renowned for practical jokes, seeing him take on the role of the trickster, and shape-shifting, swapping babies for changelings, and pestering people in their sleep were all part of his repertoire. And again, we can see crossover with Queen Mab there. Now, granted, the trickster aspect of Robin Goodfellow does appear in some of Robin Hood's antics, especially regarding what Robin Hood does to the likes of the Sheriff of Nottingham or Prince John. But Robin Goodfellow is very much linked with the home, not a wildwood. So straight away you have to go, hang on, the actual locations in which we would find these characters are very, very different. But it gets weirder, because Adalbert Kuhn also identified Robin Hood as Wodan. Now, for him, Hood came from Wodan, and then the Robin part apparently came from Ruprecht, a popular name for Wodan. Now, part of Kuhn's evidence was seasonal festivals held in both Germany and England, as if the similarity could prove Robin Hood and Wodan were one of the same. One of these examples was a northern German festival in which an actor rode a white horse. Somehow, the article isn't really specific as to the mechanics of this, but the horse was rigged to sound like it was snapping at people. And Kuhn pointed to the English hobby horse tradition at Christmas in Ramsgate, where an actor would carry a horse's head on a pole, and then the actor hid under a cloth, and then when he pulled a string, it would move the lower jaw and make the horse snap at people, which was known as a hooden horse. Yes, it does sound a little bit like the Mary Lloyd as well in Welsh, but it is actually a different sort of tradition. Lots of the horse things are vaguely similar, but in this one there is like specifics to the Ramsgate version. But basically he's essentially going, ooh, there's a snapping horse in one and a snapping horse in the other, so it must be the same thing. Now, according to Kuhn, in the German version, the horse rider himself was Wodan, and then that's where he reckoned that Hooden, as in the Hooden horse, came from Wodan, meaning that Robin Hood's surname was this variation on Hooden. But the problem with all of this is that Wodan was the central figure in feasts associated with the arrival of summer in Germany, whereas the English Hooden horses appeared at Christmas, so like literally the opposite end of the year. And it's also not the only problem. The fact that Robin Hood and the festivals described by Kuhn actually bear no relation to each other is another problem. Now, thankfully, Francis James Child actually refuted that myth and nobody accepted it with any degree of seriousness. But it is quite interesting to see that somebody could literally find these really tenuous links and draw a theory out of it. And speaking of tenuous links and pulling together a theory that people will either refute or actually believe, we're going to come to Margaret Murray. And I know I do dunk on her quite a lot on the podcast, but there is a reason for that, because here is a woman who would just draw threads out of nothing, and she has then gone on to influence quite a lot of stuff, which is basically just being built on somebody's assumption rather than evidence. And that is a problem. Anyway, Margaret Murray suggested that Robin Hood was the remnant of a pre-Christian religion beloved by the people as a fertility god, and this to her explains the antipathy from Robin towards clergymen, and this is all in The God of the Witches. Now, Murray clearly misses the wider context here, because at the time that these stories were set, the church was a massive landlord, and Robin was basically treating them as landlords, and that's why he treats the clergy and the Sheriff of Nottingham in the exact same way. So he has an issue with landlords, not the clergy. And that's an important distinction to make, really, because Robin apparently in some of the ballads actually says Mass before dining, and he follows Catholic protocols in the stories before the Reformation. So given Murray's trying to claim that he's actually this pre-Christian god, why would he demonstrate such Catholic behaviour in the ballads themselves? Now, as you might expect, given Murray's involvement, evidence is scant at best for her theory. One of the best examples of how it's just utterly wrong is Murray even suggested that Robin's band of merry men had 12 men and 1 woman, which she thought suggested a Grandmaster and his coven. At one point there's also a mention of like 12 men, and you're like, well, is that not just the apostles? That would make more sense. But anyway, there are actually plenty of stories in which Robin has more or fewer people in his band than these 13. And in The Little Guest of Robin Hood, he actually has 140. So as far as I'm aware, that is quite a big number compared to 13. Murray even tries to rewrite his death. So I mentioned earlier he was bled to death by his aunt. Murray tries to rewrite that as the sacrifice of a god and sort of tries to link it into this sacrificial god and death and rebirth kind of thing throughout the year. But Robin was an old man at the time. He wasn't a young man in his prime, as a lot of these sacrificial stories are. So that doesn't make sense either. And she also tried to claim that variations of Robin Hood in different parts of the country were actually Robin with a hood, and then pointed to the ubiquity of head coverings among the fairy folk. So at this point you're asking Margaret, is he a fertility god or one of the good neighbours? Can you not make up your mind? Is there a problem deciding that? It is actually worth noting that Sir James Fraser, for all of his many flaws, didn't actually try to claim Robin Hood as a god at all. So I'm not 100% sure where Margaret Murray got her idea from, but literally none of it actually works. But it's just fascinating how she tries so hard to make it work. And I think with a lot of the things she comes out with, you can very much hear the hammering of trying to get that round peg into a square hole. But I did mention about the fact you try to link him with the fairy folk, so it is worth quickly having a little bit of a look at that. Because what exactly do we make of Robin and his men wearing green, which is traditionally the fairy colour? Well, I don't know how to say this, but they lived in the forest. They're hardly going to have worn royal blue, are they? And in some of the stories, it actually specifies that the men wore brown in autumn and winter and then green in spring and summer. So it's essentially camouflage wear. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And also, there's an illustration from 1550 which accompanied the play of Robin Hood, which actually saw Robin wearing armour, yet also wielding a bow and arrow. So he's not even wearing green, and he's also most definitely not wearing a hood. So it's quite easy to look at different elements of the Robin Hood ballads and the huge amount of evidence that we've got of illustrations and plays and so on to go, well, actually, that doesn't work when you look at any of these theories about who or what Robin might have actually represented. So what do we actually make of Robin Hood as a figure from myth? Well, the easiest way of looking at it is just to remember that Robin Hood already is a myth. We don't have to link him to extra mythical figures. Robin in and of himself has been adapted and reused and rewritten and rebooted and whatever else so many times since he first appeared in the medieval period that he already has so many myths about him. He has become a figure of myth. Even if you accept that there may be some grain of truth that he was very loosely based on a real person, much like King Arthur, at the same time, the legends themselves have taken on their own life and their own existence. New characters have been added and all this kind of thing. Like Maid Marian ended up being added and so on. Other characters have ended up being a little bit forgotten about, like Friar Tuck. And it comes to the point where everybody is largely familiar with at least the name, if nothing else, and you don't need to then start bolting on all these extra things as well. So you can just enjoy Robin Hood as a myth. And like I said about one of the other figures, I think it might have been Hearn, if enough people believe in the mythical hero of Robin Hood, then as an egregore, does he not then become the mythical hero of Robin Hood? So again, you can make him into a myth purely by continuing to tell his stories. It's a really long-winded way of saying Margaret Murray was wrong. I hope you've enjoyed this particular month. I actually really have, because I wasn't expecting to go to some of the places that I did with it, and I think it has just sort of solidified in my mind at least that folklore is a very, very odd beast at the best of times. We are obviously going to also be changing topic for next month, and what we're going to be having a look at is folklore of some European cities, because I know quite a lot of people enjoyed the stories about places. So we're going to be starting off with Helsinki. And again, these are going to be cities that I've been to, because at least I've got some kind of connection with them. But somebody asked for Vienna last time I did this. So yes, we will definitely be doing Vienna as well. So I hope that you'll enjoy the European cities, legends and ghost stories and all that kind of thing, because it's quite nice to sort of get out away from British folklore periodically. We will be going back to plants for June, plants and trees. I haven't decided on the theme exactly, but so just be aware that that's what's coming up over the next couple of months. There is obviously still an absolute ton of content on Patreon. So there's 50 odd, I think, now bonus episodes. I am slowly but surely also making some of my illustrated talks available Some of these are talks that I've given for people like Cresswell Crags. Other ones were originally for Patreon supporters, and I'm making them available for sale at like £5 a piece, and you can buy those either through my Patreon page or through Coffee as well, and the links are below. If you've got like a special interest in something like Ghostwatch or Medusa in art, there are talks on things like that. So I am slowly adding more and more to them as well, so you can always check them out if you're bored and you'd like to learn a bit more about different types of folklore. But anyway, thank you as ever for your support this month. Obviously, I've had some really genuinely lovely reviews, which always puts a smile on my face, and it always kind of makes it worthwhile doing this kind of stuff as well. So if you have left a review this month, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate it. And if you haven't, well, it would be lovely if you did. That's all I'm saying. But anyway, I will see you next week when we get into the legends and folklore of some of the European cities. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.